meeting we had, there was some criticism of my using Abby Martin as a exemplary journalist concerning Venezuela. And I'd like to make a couple comments on that score. What I in point of fact said is that she did what a good journalist will do with respect to a situation in another country. She went there, she talked to the people, she looked in the stores, she talked to people who were in community organization, and she found out what was happening to the people on the streets in Venezuela. Max Blumenthal did this as well. Vanessa Bailey and Vanessa Bailey and Ava Bartlett. Ava Bartlett did this with respect to Syria. This is what a journalist will do. Do I have any questions with concerning Abby Martin? Well, she left the Russian government-sponsored television program by her assertion because of what Russia had done in the Ukraine. However, the Russian government offered her to pay her expenses to go to the Ukraine and examine the situation on the ground, as she did in Venezuela. Instead, she left without that investigation, which suggests to me that her resignation from that particular television program had nothing to do with Russia's behavior in the Ukraine, but had everything to do with the flack that she was getting from her fellow journalists for working for a Russian government-sponsored television program. That is not a journalistic decision. That is a personal decision based on who your friends are and how valuable they are to you and what attitudes they have towards the people for whom you are working. Journalism requires a sense of honesty. I don't expect any journalist to be unbiased. I ask them not to lie to me. I learn what their biases are and how to filter out their biases from established fact. Okay, we'll go on from there. And the second item that I can chat about without having my cheat sheet is Udo Ulfkati. Udo Ulfkati's book, Bought Journalists, has now been published by a very small publishing company in the United States. It's got a very long, tedious title. But that's not the issue. What I want you to know about it is that it now exists. And by virtue of existing, we now have great evidence that the vast majority of journalists in the Western Hemisphere are indebted to the state security agencies. Obviously, in the case of the United States, we're talking about the CIA. I don't know what the name of it would be in Germany, but Ulfkati, Dan's writing the name down because it's new to him, Ulfkotte, an absolutely brilliant individual. He had serious heart problems. He'd had 3 heart attacks. Paul Craig Roberts is not sure whether his terminal heart attack was induced by some security agency. As a physician, I'm inclined to think not, but that certainly is a matter for debate. The point of the matter is that from the very beginning of his career, he was in the employ of the German security agency, not so much voluntarily, but by seduction. Everyone is familiar with Jeffrey Epstein's work in terms of seducing officials in terms of in order to get them to be compliant. But the same trick, the same application works, of course. Third item that I wanted to chat with you about could be entitled, "It Ain't Broke, It Is Fixed." And I will describe 7 centers of power in the United States and demonstrate to you that each and every one of them is not working for your benefit, but is working for, let me call them the elites, the powers that be, not only the deep state, but the very wealthy individuals who have a vested interest in what is going on in the country. The first one is the media and media and telecommunications. And in 1933, Franklin Roosevelt told his fellow elites, because Roosevelt was in the elite group in the United States, he said, "You can either let the population have a lot of crumbs from our table, or they will upset the table." The situation was sufficiently desperate in the United States. There was an active Communist Party, 2 active Socialist parties, and the union movement was well underway. His fellow elites said, "Okay, give them what you think will hold off this revolution," because we were on the verge of a revolution. We had, prior to that time, you had the World War I veterans marching on Washington en masse, demanding their discharge rewards. I don't recall what they were, but they were bonds that were supposed to be cashed in X number of years after their discharge, and the vets were sufficiently hungry, they wanted their money now. The Communist Party and the 2 Socialist parties had put up candidates in recent elections. They were gathering noticeable numbers of votes, and people were angry. So Roosevelt gave the people the New Deal, a lot of New Deal, established the protection so that your money was insured if it was in a bank, because a lot of money was lost in 1929. It wasn't lost by the people with a lot of money, it was lost by people who had hundreds or tens of dollars in the local banks. Because the people who had a lot of money knew the crash was coming and got their money out ahead of time. Indeed, the people with a lot of money engineered the crash, because a lot of the value on the stock market in 1929 was predicated on money that had been borrowed from the banking system in order to buy stock. But the banking system had the right, anytime it, that is to say they, wanted to call in those loans. They were short-term loans. Well, they started calling in the short-term loans. And the only way the borrowers could fulfill their loans was to cash in their stocks. Therefore, the price of the stocks started plummeting. And the people who knew that was going to happen got out early. So, let's talk about the banking industry. Now, we had started on media first. I don't know if anybody in this room approved of telemarketers calling you 24 hours a day except at supper time. But our government approved of that. They might include the nighttime hours from 11 p.m. to 5 a.m. I'm not sure on that score. But they were designated times. It was our government that, instead of protecting the public with antitrust legislation, with the enforcement of antitrust legislation, Bill Clinton's administration allowed 5 major media companies to dominate the media market in the United States. So what 90+% of the American public hear on radio, on television, and in their print media is directed by the directors of 5 companies. Those 5 companies, like the Washington Post, like the New York Times, work in close cooperation with the CIA. I don't know whether you like having your news filtered and being approved of by the CIA or by whichever political party happens to be in power, but I would submit that that does not work to the advantage of the American people. Most of us are familiar with ALEC, and I don't recall what the individual letters stand for, but it is an organization of lobbyists who act as consultants for our representative government. Our representative government at the federal level and our representative governments at the state level. And they propose legislation that these lobbyists consider to be beneficial to whom? To the public? To their employers. And in a great percentage of the time, the Congress people, because they are busy themselves recruiting money for their next election, sign their names at the bottom as the sponsor of this or that particular bill. So, if you think our media is out to present information to the public, I have very tragic information for you. AIPAC. AIPAC, for all the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, is that umbrella agency that determines what the American Jewish opinion wants our congressional representatives to enact for the benefit of the nation state of Israel. There is a comparable agency that is delegated the responsibility of influencing the executive branch. That is the Association of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations, and that's the Association of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations of America, or very close there. In other words, they are using the presidents of major Jewish organizations as a lobbying group in order to influence the executive branch. By virtue of contributions, they, for all practical purposes, control who is and who is not elected. William Fulbright, Paul Finley, help me here, Quinn, and X number of other congresspersons and senators who have dared to raise objections about the extent to which the United States defends and supports and underwrites the state of Israel. Any number of them have lost their jobs because at specific times in the electoral cycle, they have either been bad-mouthed by AIPAC or they have simply been outspent by AIPAC does not spend money itself. It does not give money itself. It tells other Jewish agencies under it to whom to give money in terms of electoral support and to whom to withhold it. They will occasionally go after, in terms of bad-mouthing, someone who is especially vocal, but most of the time it is by positive positive financial support of the person running against a Paul Finley or a J. William Fulbright.
So,
Quinn.
just important piece of that is the billions of dollars that our government sends to Israel.
Oh, yeah,
For
absolutely.
years and years. So it's kind of hard to say who controls who, but I don't think anything that Israel gets goes along with American imperialism. So, but
Well,
I just want to say on the media thing, in terms of the CIA, and my understanding is the CIA from the beginning imported Nazi scientists for mind control programs and have been soliciting brain scientists for excessive research on mind control. And that mind control, it's about controlling individuals, but it's also about controlling the masses through the media.
Absolutely.
And I think that that's
Needs
another
to be mentioned as
CIA
well.
crime
Yeah.
that is scary.
That leads me to expand on one point. The media you get is like a funnel. It is like the funnel it is like the stockyard gates that direct the cattle forward.
Mhm.
And if it is outside the funnel, if it is beyond the gates, it doesn't exist because you don't hear it.
That's right.
If there is a revolution in Bolivia, which there was not a revolution, it was a coup d'etat, if it is not announced and explained to you in your media, it didn't happen. And if it is explained to you in your media, you are receiving a digested, you are receiving a pablum that is approved by both the deep state and the power elite.
But I think just because I've lived through those years, as you have, I've watched the difference, and it's always been a problem. It's not like it's new, but it's definitely gotten worse since the Vietnam War, when there was a draft and when there was a tremendous protest movement rose up. And so then gradually, and there was still a movement, there was a huge anti-nuke movement in the 1980s. And
I'm glad I wrote these notes, Quinn.
Soon as
But I can't get the computer to
H.W.
work.
Bush got on the scene, and you can hear it, I mean, he was known to brag after people finally, told so many lies about the first Gulf War, they told so many lies that people started supporting it, when they hadn't in the beginning. And he was known to brag, I guess we knocked out that Vietnam syndrome. And that Vietnam syndrome was people's impulse to object, you know, if our government was going around the world killing people. But I think H.W. Bush was a major source of difficulty.
And Bill Clinton, but
Yeah,
let
him
me
too.
expand on
Yeah.
that.
I'm not with the Democrats either.
The deep state and the military-industrial complex learned two very important things. One from the Vietnam War and the other one from the destruction of Yugoslavia. And what they learned was that they cannot fight imperial wars with a draft. What they have established in lieu of the draft system, which was abolished after the end of the Vietnam War, is a financial draft. The people who volunteer into the military nowadays can't get a job elsewhere,
Yeah, poverty draft.
or they cannot get an education elsewhere. That's one thing that the deep state and the elites learned. So they adapted. These people are evil, but they are not stupid. I've said that in the past, and I'll repeat it.
And they have the help of a lot of brain scientists.
Oh, yes.
This is a big
Quinn wants
part.
me to expand on that. There is not only the information, if I can find it, I have a picture of the ideal family for you. The picture is presented in a MediaCom advertisement. And you have two darling little children and a wife and a husband. They're all facing forward, looking at a GD screen. That is the ideal American family. It is exactly the ideal family that mind control, as Quinn is insisting that I talk about, is advanced and is intentionally programmed into people. 90% of your opinion that you acquire as an adult is acquired from your media. Until and unless you have learned to think for yourself and get alternative information, what Rachel Maddow thinks is what you think. who are the other favorite? There is a in the past he has struck me as very intelligent, but he is on WVIK on Saturday mornings in the something live.
Don Wooten?
Pardon?
Don Wooten?
Yes. Nice old gentleman.
He's gotta be old, he's like 99.
Yeah. Well, he quotes Rachel Maddow as if she's an authority figure. He mouths what Rachel Maddow says about Russia as if he believes it, as if he knows it to be true. What he knows is what Rachel Maddow has told him. Okay? And
who is this guy that you're talking about? Is he a journalist also?
he is a radio announcer, basically.
On what station or what?
WVIK,
He's been there
WVIK.com.
forever, it's like,
Yeah.
Like what?
Comes on
he's been there
after,
forever, he's been
Oh.
yeah, he's been on there forever and he
a
comes
radio
on.
personality, and
Yeah.
he's been there for a long time, back in the 70s.
And on a lot of subjects, he's quite intelligent. But it's apparent that he is repeating what his authorities have told him. Bless his heart, my younger son absorbs what is presented on, not TED Talks, but TED Radio. And the guys who present the programs on TED Radio are not doing their own research. They're pulling it in from the funnel. So if the information is from outside the funnel, you don't get it. And if you don't get it, it doesn't exist. So starting at least in 1953, the CIA came to believe that the communists had indeed perfected mind control, because why did so many vets come back from Korea believing what the Koreans had told them? Oddly enough, they had started to listen to what the Koreans were saying. And they decided, you know what? It makes a whole lot more sense than what my sergeant's been telling me. But that was an impossible conclusion for the powers that be to accept from the Korean vets who were coming back. So they came to believe in mind control, and they went about trying to find out how to do it. And on any of a number of levels, they have succeeded. Hypnotism is mostly viewed as a parlor trick or as an entertainment. But in point of fact, when it is used on the 10% of the population that is highly susceptible to hypnotism, it's an incredibly dangerous weapon. There is a book out by a young woman who successfully was liberated from the hypnotic suggestion that she had been living with most of her life. It's called Secret, Don't Tell. And if you want to find out about the atrocious uses of hypnotism, then you have to read it. It's a thick book, but it's well illustrated, and the young woman, or the woman, she's probably not young now, does a very good job of describing how a susceptible individual can be literally turned into another human being.
So the Manchurian Candidate was a way to turn what we were doing and saying, oh, the Chinese are doing it, right? And they're
Yes,
the ones
yeah,
who
the
behind it
Manchurian
all.
Candidate.
And that's the 50s, yeah.
So the use of human beings, especially susceptible human beings, has been, in fact, let me go back just a second, but I'm losing track, because I want to talk about these 7 centers. We haven't gotten beyond the media yet. Thank you, Quinn.
Well, I agree with what you're saying. It's very
Yeah.
disturbing, I think, that we have so little actual information available.
That is the media, the military-industrial complex. How it controls the way you think is multifaceted, there is not a county in the country that has a military installation that does not have mom and pop stores or bigger stores or a newspaper or a radio station that isn't glad that they have employment in that county and supports whatever particular project that military installation is doing, whether they are creating rockets, whether they are creating missiles that are subsequently being sold to Yemen, whether it is being used for spikelet bombs, the bomblets that explode in the air when, or they explode when they hit the ground, and about 10% of them don't explode until some kid picks them up because they look like a toy. What's the name of that weapon?
I know what you mean, kids
It's not a fragmentation bomb, but
Is it
you
a
get
cluster?
the idea.
Cluster.
Cluster
Yeah,
bombs,
that's
thank
it.
you. Cluster bombs. So the military-industrial complex has learned that they have to seduce public support for the military-industrial complex. It is not enough to buy the congressperson. You have to buy the local community. How many people would like to see Lockheed closed south of Cedar Rapids? Okay, that's the military-industrial complex, as I say. Now, we'll let that go. APAC not only receives now it's about $4 billion per year from the United States government. A host of agencies that support Israel have the categorization of tax exempt when they are anything but educational or charitable. Okay? A person with dual citizenship up until 1965 was at risk of being deprived of his American citizenship until a person who voted in an Israeli election came back, having participated in Israeli democracy, such as it is, and was challenged in terms of his voting rights. It went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court marvelously said dual citizenship is now accepted. So there are some things more powerful than the Constitution.
I think that is beginning to change. They're getting really worried because the young people, the young Jewish people are not buying into that. You know, the Jewish Voice for Peace.
You are well, JVP is a different issue, but Quinn is pointing out that the younger and poorer generation
Yeah, right, probably
Jews.
that's connected, yeah.
are having major problems with Israeli politics and the way Israeli politics influence American politics. But that has not influenced the major Jewish contributors who say, I have one issue. And these are billionaires, not millionaires. I have one issue, and that issue is Israel. The fact that Gwen is absolutely right, that from a social point of view, that community support, the support from the Jewish American community is dissolving. But the support at the top financial level is as solid as ever. I knew that Donald Trump was serious about running for the presidency when he solicited the financial support of a major Jewish billionaire. Up until that point, it had a lot of the markings of a person who wanted to use former presidential candidate as part of his advertising campaign.
So I think the billionaires are for each other.
Oh, they do,
The Israeli
absolutely.
billionaires, the American billionaires.
Billionaires.
They're all, you know, they're like Chris Hedges says, oligarchy is killing us. I mean, the billionaires are the problem.
George Soros and Lord Rothschild have more in common with Bill Gates than they do with Tevye the milkman. Okay? There may be occasional issues where the Jewish billionaires and the Goyish billionaires disagree. But unless it's a major issue, they will stick together as billionaires rather than divide on the question of ethnicity.
And
And
even,
that's
even if we're
that's an
talking about-
important point in
Yes.
terms of where you look for the power centers. Go ahead,
As
quick.
long as it's not assumed that the Israeli billionaires are the problem more so than the American billionaires.
Oh.
I mean, I'm just telling you, my point of view is being billionaires is the problem, and we have so
Oh,
many of those.
of course,
I
of course.
mean, and I think
And-
it's forgotten that, you know, even, even in the Holocaust, the majority of Jews that were killed were poor.
We won't get into that today.
Yeah,
Because I'm still trying to read. You weren't here last year, were you? Or were you?
once in a while, yeah.
Once in a while. There is a program that was entitled Anti-Semitism ? And I made the mistake of entitling it Anti-Semitism ? Because that got the attention of some censor. So it was not allowed on Google.
Hmm.
So I need to look at that and reconsider. It
Well,
was,
but,
it
yeah,
was not anti-Semitic, but the name got somebody's attention.
The whole idea of what anti-Semitism is so confused.
Oh, it's not
Stuff
confused, it
about
very well,
Israel,
I would disagree with you on that.
Anti-Semitic to criticize Israel. I just saw this Stephen Miller, you know, that, he's like a major advisor to Trump. And all sorts of information has come out about his connection with, alt-right, you know, with white supremacists. Right. And so Trump is now saying the criticism, because he's Jewish, he's saying the criticism with
With what's,
criticism
as
of
things are going now, I would
Miller,
like to be able to see the clock.
criticism of Miller is anti-Semitic, Trump is saying. So it's like more of that,
There are two
it
definitions.
needs to be, you know, disentangled. That's why.
It's not tangled. It's a matter of whether you accept what the system is giving you in the funnel or whether you go outside.
Right.
Traditionally, words are defined by their usage, okay? The usage of anti-Semitic is hostility to an ethnic group for no cause, for a specific ethnic group for no cause.
Mhm, yeah.
Now, the certain powers want to both legally and socially redefine anti-Semitism as opposition to anything Jewish persons, including Israeli persons, do. That's a different definition. If they succeed in getting into law, it has legal implications, but that is not the way traditionally any word is defined. So that if you take the way the word is traditionally defined, it is inappropriate, unjustified hostility to a group that has no basis in historical fact.
Yeah, that's right.
Now,
Do you mind
I have
disagree
yet,
with
I am in the
historical
I am in the process of researching. In the Middle Ages, the Jewish tribe was evicted from the vast majority at one time or another from European countries. The vast majority of Jews at that time had no or incredibly little contact with the Gentiles of their community. They lived in isolated shtetl, they lived in ghettos that were enforced not by the civilian authorities around them, but by their religious leaders so that they would not be contaminated by Goyisha. So the only Jews that had substantial contact with the Goy population were the bankers, were the merchants. And according to Talmudic tradition, You are allowed to do things to a goy that you are not allowed to do to a fellow Jew. Now that's in the Talmud. I'm not saying that the Jews by and large believe that, but I would say that when you are dealing in business, the image of Shylock that Shakespeare presents is probably an accurate understanding of what a Jew is like to the Gentile population around them, around Shakespeare. Because they were dealing with people who were merchants, who were in a position to defraud if they chose to. And if they chose to, it did not have the same moral reprobation that it would have if that same Jew were to defraud a fellow Jew. And I'm just talking about Talmudic sociology. I wouldn't even call it theology. Okay? So, you're getting me off on 16 different tangents.
Sorry.
So we're talking
I
about
I won't
APEC.
argue, I think I disagree with you, but I won't argue because it's getting late.
I can present the Talmudic information. That's
Yeah,
all.
there's a lot of crappy stuff in the Talmud,
I agree.
but also in the Bible.
Absolutely.
I mean, I've, you know,
And fortunately,
I'm
the
not-
vast
I won't
majority,
disagree with that.
fortunately, the vast majority of Christians read selectively. They don't. I will point out that when the Ir Yassin underwent the massacre in April of 1948, it was viewed as a simple massacre by the goys of the world. But the Palestinian population fully understood that this was a carrying out of the genocide that was enacted in the book of Numbers. I think it was Numbers or Exodus. But in any case, in the conquest of Canaan, as depicted in the Old Testament, Joshua committed genocide. No other word for it. And the people of Palestine saw the massacre of the Ir Yassin, and it was intended to be seen as a warning to any other Palestinian community that didn't get the hell out of Palestine. Which is why 750,000 of Palestinians fled, because they were not prepared to defend themselves against a militant and armed Jewish population in Palestine. Okay, have we dealt sufficiently with AIPAC? Military-industrial complex. The banking industry. We're not going to be able to cover all seven because I don't have the ability to remind myself. But the banking industry controls what the Federal Reserve Bank does with what is called a revolving door. Because once you finish working in the Treasury Department or in the State Department, you take a position on Wall Street. If you take a look at Bill Clinton's administration, you have a revolving door between the Department of State, the Department of Treasury, the Federal Reserve System, and the Wall Street Bank. Now, who, when they are working in the Treasury Department or in the State Department, who they know they're going to be revolving around and working at a Wall Street Bank, who is going to start enforcing legislation or proposing legislation that is going to be injurious to Wall Street? No. The revolving door, by the way, applies both to the CDC and the DEA, physicians who work for the Drug Enforcement Agency and the DEA and the CDC wind up as editors of journals or working for agencies in the drug industry or for a major hospital chain. There's a revolving door. And unfortunately, it makes a certain kind of sense, because you want an expert in drug administration to be very active in those drugs that are being developed. So that makes sense. But I will point out that in 1985 or 1986, our government warranted and required the increased number of vaccinations of children, with virtually zero indication of the social necessity of those vaccinations. But it had great financial advantages for the drug companies for which they were going to subsequently go to work. Okay. I want to deal with Bolivia and the Ukraine now. There was a recent coup d'etat in Bolivia, and this part of the discussion, Dawn, you might call Dimensions of Empire. I brought this book along quite intentionally. I have a great admiration for William Bloom, and I have a little something that I can boast about, because William Bloom has done an excellent job of documenting the subversion of a host of countries between World War II and the present day. Bloom died tragically after lingering because of falling down some stairs, I believe, and his death was mourned by a whole host of people, and it really is tragic. One of his later essays was comparing and equating Wahhabi Islam and saying that Wahhabi Islam was representative of all Islam. And I had the privilege of corresponding with Dr. Bloom and said, if Wahhabi Islam is representative of Islam, then the settler who accosted myself and some colleagues outside of Hebron is representative of Judaism. And I knew full well that he would not accept that parallel, so I pointed out that militant Islam is very critical of Wahhabi Islam. The head of Hezbollah is clearly a militant Islamist, and he is very critical of Wahhabi theology and is a devout advocate for legitimate Shia Islam. And the legitimate Shia Islam recognizes the clear distinction between an enemy combatant and an innocent civilian, whereas Wahhabi Islam considers anyone who is not your kind of Muslim is a heretic and worthy of death. And Bill never responded to my response, but I told him in another letter later that, Bill, I observed that there's been a gentle shift in your understanding of Islam, and I'd like to claim credit for it. And at the very least, Bill never sent a letter saying, you're wrong, there's been no change in my position. But I think it's difficult for a Jewish journalist who has once taken a position on Islam to reverse course. But he did not contradict my assertion. What I'm saying here is that people grow up with all kinds of blinders. And the very fact that Bill gave evidence of having taken off at least part of his blinders suggests to me that he was a very honest and good man. Okay, I got started on that because of the book that William Bloom wrote. You will be told, probably, that a Christian revolution took place in Bolivia. If you hear about it at all, I've seen remarkably little about the Bolivian coup d'etat, and it came as something of a surprise to me. But five of the leaders of the Bolivian coup d'etat have very recently served as attachés in the Bolivian embassy in Washington. The financing for the coup d'etat almost certainly came from US aid ID. Up until about 1990, the CIA would have been responsible for the financing, but the US deep state has found it much more practical to disconnect themselves from the agencies that are actually providing the financing. But this process of the United States financing rebels for the sake of fomenting a revolution and or a coup d'etat goes all through American history from 1945 to the present. As we get more information, I'm confident that we will find out that the fingerprints of the American deep state are all over the coup d'etat. And one of the things that is striking about those fingerprints is that they invariably, whether you were talking about Pinochet, whether we're talking about, well, I can't name them all. When we're talking about the dictators that the United States has supported, almost without exception, I might be wrong, I might be appropriate in saying without exception, are fascist in their leanings, they're authoritarian and dictatorship in their administration, but they are pro-American. They are pro-capitalism. They are all for redistributing the resources of the state upward to the elites. Most of the time, the deep state exploits conflicts within the community itself. In Bolivia, the conflicts were between the Latinos, the native Spanish-speaking and Spanish-originating population, and the Indígena, the Indian population that was indigenous to Bolivia since time immemorial. Also, the Latinos are Christian, and they're basically being called Christian fascists now, and one of their mottos is that you will not see the pagan god of the Bolivian Indians on our media any longer, because the participants of the coup have seized the public media. That leads me into the last comment I want to make, and it's about Ukraine, because if we have heard remarkably little about Bolivia, we have been swamped with all sorts of lies about the coup d'etat that took place in February 22nd of 2014 in Kiev, Ukraine. At that point in time, and this is why I wanted to get a couple maps off of my computer. Ukraine's earlier name was Little Rus. It is in fact the area of the country that acted as the source and kernel for the Russian people. And the Russian people spread north and east and south from the area of eastern Ukraine. If I were to show you a map of the people who elected Yanushchenko, who was the ousted president, you would see a line crossing from northeastern Ukraine to southwestern Ukraine, and the people to the east of that line voted overwhelmingly for Yushchenko, and the people west of that line voted overwhelmingly for the pro-European Union candidate. If I were to show you a map of the Ukraine where the primary language used by the population was Russian, that line would correspond roughly to that same line going from the northeast to the southwest. And the people to the east of that line were primarily Russian-speaking, and the people to the west of that line were primarily Ukrainian-speaking. Now, Ukrainian is basically a dialect of Russian, but there is enough difference so that the fascists who were attempting to enforce the coup d'etat were asking the people who were attempting to be loyal to the former administration, they were asking them to sing the Ukrainian anthem in Ukrainian rather than in Russian. The deep state foments discord in order to get the kind of administration that the American West wants. In 1996, William Jefferson Clinton endorsed, they were not yet accepted, but he endorsed the acceptance of Hungary, the Czech Republic, and 2 other countries that were formerly members of the Eastern Bloc. Now, what you need to know is that in 1992, George Baker negotiated an agreement with Gorbachev, Mikhail Gorbachev. And he was negotiating as an official negotiator for the United States. Since the Berlin Wall had fallen and East Germany was no longer considered a Soviet vassal, the agreement that Baker negotiated with Gorbachev was that if the USSR accepted the unification of East and West Germany, NATO would not move 1 inch further east than East Germany. William Jefferson, 4 years later, William Jefferson Clinton endorsed the violation of that agreement. And early in the next century, those 4 nations and subsequent nations were absorbed into NATO in total contradiction to the agreement that George Baker had made with Gorbachev. There are at least 2 red lines for the Russian Federation. Those 2 red lines are the Ukraine and Georgia. And Lavrov, after Jefferson Clinton made that endorsement, communicated to the American ambassador in Moscow that "niet" means "niet." Ukraine and Georgia are red lines. And if NATO is offered to Ukraine and Ukraine accepts, there will be war. Likewise in Georgia. The American government fomented a war between Georgia and the breakaway province of Georgia that was primarily populated by Russians, and when their independence was being challenged by the Georgian government, Russia stepped in and promptly proved to Georgia that they were not in control of that independent province. The point that I am making with this is that American foreign policy has been guided by about 2 or 3 closely related principles. And we're going to get to the 3rd principle next week, so I'm not going to tell you about it. But 2 of the principles are that an empire enriches itself by treating its vassals as sources of wealth, as any capital nation state will do. Capital flows to the center and up to the ruling elites. In a capitalist empire, capital moves from the vassal states as sources of wealth to the center and the ruling elites of the center upward. Moreover, an empire knows 2 kinds of unrelated states: vassal states and enemy states. Today, Bolivia is no longer an enemy state because it is now a vassal state. Cuba has been an enemy state for well over 50 years because it refuses to be a vassal state. China and Russia are now openly considered enemy states because they have vigorously opposed being vassal states. End of discussion.
I just before I came, I heard an interview with Morales, who's back in Bolivia, and he is saying he understands now. He apparently was accepting help from the Organization of American States, which is
He made the mistake.
South American
Yeah.
countries, and he's saying, I now realize they are not working in the interests of the Latin American people, but in the interests of America.
It's astonishing that he's just realizing that.
Yeah, I
Craig.
was kind of, maybe just said it that way, but that's what he said.
Morales, who is the evicted president of Bolivia, had made major contributions to Bolivian society while he was president. He reduced poverty by about 40%. He reduced extreme poverty by about 70%. The numbers are not exact. He increased literacy by I cannot cite the exact number, but he made at least three political mistakes. Unlike Hugo Chavez and Maduro of Venezuela, Morales did not cultivate the military or the police as power centers. He had a substantial popularity among the people, but he did not cultivate the military or the police as supporting power centers. And secondly, astonishingly, he sought to have the Organization of American States adjudicate a conflict when his opposition challenged the most recent election. The most recent election had him winning the popular vote by in excess of 10%, but his opposition was claiming foul on a number of what most lawyers would call technicalities. And instead of calling those technicalities and asking for an internal adjudication, he asked the OAS to do it. The OAS is an instrument of the American federal government, just as the World Bank is an instrument of the federal government, just as the other financial agency.
IMF.
Pardon?
IMF.
Yes, just as the IMF. Because the American financial system and the financial system that is dictated by the United States came into practice at the end of World War II. The United States has been in the remarkable position of being able to print money, whereas other nation states needed to earn it. They achieved this position by having most of the gold in the world at the end of World War II, and by negotiating an agreement with Saudi Arabia and subsequently most of the other oil-producing countries, made the agreement that the oil-producing countries would only accept payment for their oil in American dollars. If Argentina needed to buy oil, they needed to buy something from America in order to get American dollars. Or, I mean, sell something to America in order to get American dollars to use to buy oil. So they had, Argentina was then forced to sell at whatever price the Americans were willing to pay so that they could get the American dollars. And all America had to do to give them those dollars was to print it. Argentina had to earn it by production. All the United States banking system had to do was print it. They had that privilege up until the 1970s, and the American dollar, without any gold backing, is still the major instrument of international banking. So they have remarkable financial power, even though the American industrial base has been hollowed out. One of the reasons Russia and China are perceived of as enemies is that they are working diligently to establish an alternative financial system so that when China wants to buy something from Uganda, they don't have to pay Uganda in dollars.
I think that's where Gaddafi got into trouble too, right?
Both Gaddafi and Kuwait, no, not Kuwait, Iran. Gaddafi and
Saddam.
Saddam Hussein.
Oh, was he up to that too? Oh,
Yes, Saddam Hussein said he was going to start selling oil for European
Forgot that, yeah.
euros, and Gaddafi was going to establish an independent banking system to help all of Africa deal in international finance with the gold dinar. Yes, challenging the American banking system is a short way to an early grave. Now it's the end on.